one of the most difficult aspects of being a critical thinker. And that is, how do you refute value-laden assumptions and presumptions in premises and in conclusions of arguments? Well, I guess the fact that we don't have any universal agreement on ethical, moral, political, sociological, psychological, legal, or aesthetic debates and issues should prove to you and to me and to everyone else that there is something about value-laden assumptions buried in premises that make it very difficult to compose or refute even an argument of this nature on sound grounds. True, it's easy to make a valid argument. I was at a conference recently, and one of my colleagues, who's an objective ethicist, very good at it, by the way, he proposed the following argument using a standard form categorical syllogism, the ones that you've studied, the Barbara, AAA one, and it went something like this: all those seeking to be moral are those seeking to live a virtuous life. That's the major premise. His minor premise was all ethical humans are those who seek to be moral. Therefore, all ethical humans are those who seek the virtuous life. Now, that's a valid argument. And the conference went on debating how in the world we could either accept or refute this particular argument, whether or not this actually gives us some sort of an objective standard. First of all, let's distinguish between ethical first principles and moral codes. As we delineated in the content block below of the text below this video, we distinguish between ethical first principles and moral codes. Ethical first principles are supposed to be those universal absolute principles that govern all human behavior, regardless of circumstances. They're supposed to tell us what the principles are that guide our notions of right and wrong behavior. Once those principles are accepted, then they take the form of what are called moral codes. And we find this especially in law. We find it in medicine, where the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take. What is the Hippocratic Oath? Do no harm to your patients. Do no harm. That's an ethical first principle, and it becomes a moral code for the entire medical profession. Is it violated? Are there people who disagree with it? Yes. Believe it or not, there are those who say, well, it's up to me to kill this fetus, or it's up to me to disconnect this 95-year-old man or woman from a life support system, euthanasia, abortion. These are ethical and moral principles and systems of thought that occupy a great deal of our public debate. How do you refute those? How do you refute them? How do you refute any of these value-laden terms? Well, in the text box below this particular video, I outline certain fundamental approaches that we need to keep in mind, some things we need to keep in mind when we approach the whole problem of hearing an ethical, moral, legal, political, aesthetic, sociological, psychological argument. We know when we hear these things that they are going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to prove to be sound. Yes, we can prove them to be valid, like my colleague, the argument I just read, but proving it to be sound is quite another thing, unless, of course, you think that the source of all morality is a celestial teapot that orbits the earth and gives moral directions to all human beings. Something empirical that we could put a rocket ship up and go and look for this celestial teapot, and not finding this celestial teapot, we would adequately refute an argument. But I'm not talking about silly arguments the way Bertrand Russell made with his celestial teapot, or spaghetti monster notion of God and morality. uh, and committing the straw man fallacy of trying to make us think that people actually believe in a celestial teapot or a spaghetti monster as the basis of reality. We don't. No sane person believes anything like that. What sane and rational people believe is that there are embedded in the structure of the universe, embedded in the structure of reality, embedded in the very existence itself. There are objective standards of good and bad, of beautiful and ugly, of true and false, and of real and unreal. They really believe that. They're called objectivists. So the first thing to bear in mind is when you're looking at an ethical argument or any value-laden argument whatsoever, could be from sociology, ask yourself, is this an argument that goes to objective or subjective first principles? What do the subjectivists believe? As I say in the book, when you read the appropriate pages for this lesson, you'll see that the subjectivist is in a very weak position, it would seem, because they are facing constantly a contradiction. The subjectivist says everything is subjective. There's no such thing as objectivity. There's no such thing as objective truth. Including what I just said? Oh, no, there's an exception to what I just said. And there's no such thing as objective truth, and said unless it's the claim that I'm making that there's subjective truth and there's no objective truth. So you see, the subjectivist is not on very sure ground, because immediately we're very suspect with arguments that proceed from a contradiction. So the first thing to do is for you to identify whether you're making a value argument or whether you're refuting a value argument. First of all, state your principles. What principles are you basing your ethics on? There's a wide range of ethical and moral philosophies, not just strictly the Aristotelian, teleological, purpose-driven ethical and morality. There's also the utilitarian of John Stuart Mill. There's the pragmatism of some of the American philosophers. There's the political philosophies that presume that we cannot even know anything about ethics or morality or even value-laden terms. We simply do the best we can for the greater good, the greatest good for the greatest number. We seem to be hearing that a lot these days. So the first thing to do is to tell the listener or the reader what your first principles are. And from those first principles, as my colleague did, then you can develop your major term, your minor term, and your middle term. And if you're going to refute that argument, that's what you attack. You attack the definition of the major term, the minor term, and or the middle term. That's how you refute it. And I guess the bottom line is that these are probably the most important debates and arguments that we get into in society. Nothing less than the control of human behavior rests upon the first principles that we accept out of belief, out of faith. We have a faith. If we can't prove X is the case, but we need X to be the case in order to control people's behavior, that's what we mean by faith. That kind of faith, not necessarily spiritual faith, although that is definitely in play. As Søren Kierkegaard, the famous Danish philosopher and theologian who actually invented existentialism, as a theist, not as an atheist, but as a theist. And he wrote a whole book called Purity of Heart is to Will One Thing. And in that, what did he say? He said that the object of human meaning, the human purpose, is not something that's imposed from the outside. It's something that comes from within, from the will that we have for that one thing. And what is that one thing? That one thing is the good. And what is the good? Well, in his mind, it was God. And so he built a whole philosophy and a theology around that. But he was very clear about his first principles. If you read him, you understand exactly what he's talking about. Now, you can disagree with him, but you better have a good argument to disagree with him. And some people do. They have very good arguments. They refute Kierkegaard, saying that he's mostly a psychologist. He's not even a philosopher. No, nonetheless, he's not even a theologian. So the history of thought yields agreement only on the many options that we face in value-laden terms. But value-laden terms are probably the most important debates you will ever have. So apply what you have learned in week 1, week 2, week 3, and now here in week 4. Apply what you have done to giving some thought to refuting the ethical first principles that you hold, or the legal first principles that you hold, or the psychological first principles, or the sociological first principles, or even, if you're a music lover or you like movies, the aesthetic first principles. What are your first principles? State them, write them out, and defend them, and then turn right around and refute them. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next lesson. Lesson 6, you'll be doing precisely stating your thesis and then refuting it.